What is the ADA?
So the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in everyday activities, right? Um, it prohibits it on the basis of disability, just like other civil rights laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. There are actually like five separate sections of the ADA that come up most often, right? Title One is all about employment. So it prohibits private employers and state and local government employers basically from discriminating against people with disabilities when it comes to applying for jobs or hiring or firing, job training, all of those things. Um, Title II is basically discrimination for public entities, kind of like these are your state and local governments. And this is about their programs, their processes, their activities, and basically they have to make all of their stuff accessible. If you've ever wondered why courthouses tend to be some of the more accessible spaces, that is a very good reason why. Title III is about non-discrimination in places of public accommodation. This is the one you probably have heard the most about, and is one of the pieces of the ADA that is probably most unique to the United States, because it's not about government, it's not about what's funded, it's about private places, it's about businesses, it's about hotels, your shops, your airports, your hotels, your train stations. This basically says, hey, if you are open to the public and providing a service to the public, a place of public accommodation, guess what? You should make that place accessible to people with disabilities. And that's what makes the ADA particularly powerful, because it recognizes that people with disabilities have the right to exist and participate in our local community. And so that's the one that tends to come up probably more than any others. Titles 4 and 5 are a little bit narrower, so you probably don't hear about them as much. And that is 4 is telecommunications, and that's where we have our relay services, video phones, captioning, and that's where our accessible telephones, that's where television and captioning actually ended up under Title 4. That's why if you ever seen during an emergency or a fire, that requirement that captioning and that scroll that says the emergency information is on there is part of Title 4. Title 5 is our other category. And like I said, it's very narrow, but what's in it that's super important is it has the prohibition against retaliation in there. It also is the section that gives a definition of undue hardship. And what that is that's what lets someone basically off the hook for providing an accommodation or making something accessible. They basically have to say it's an undue hardship. And so that is defined in Title 5 of the ADA. When we're talking about who does the ADA cover, honestly, the ADA guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities that everybody else does. So who is that? Who is somebody with a disability? And it's kind of there's a 3 bullet points that come up over and over. It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And I promise I'll break that down. 2 is the person has a history or record of an impairment. A good example, actually, that is cancer that's now in remission. And the third is perceived by others, such as having an impairment, and basically is discriminated against because of that. And that's one that people go, what does that mean? And I'm like, a great example is somebody who has significant burns or scarring. And so while they may not have an impairment that impacts a major life activity, they will certainly be treated differently because of it. And so it would fall into that category. And I think here's the thing that I think is really important for folks to remember. For many of us, when we think about disability, we think about people who use wheelchairs. We think people who are deaf, or people who are like me, blind and visually impaired. What we don't necessarily think about, but are disabilities, are things like cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, depression, anxiety. Those are also disabilities. So how do you know if you're considered disabled under the ADA? Honestly, there is no secret handshake to the Disability Club. There is no certificate of authenticity. There is no letter delivered by OWL. In fact, many people actually might not even realize that they, air quotes here, count as being disabled. Right? Let's go back to that definition of the ADA, right? It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more activities. Substantially limits is really defined pretty broadly. right? Whether something substantially limits a major life activity, it kind of is something that has to be individually assessed because it varies from person to person. A broad general way to think about it might be an individual's ability to perform something compared to somebody in the general population. And it's not just they can't do it, but okay, they can do it, but it causes huge pain, or they can do it, but it takes them much, much longer, right? That substantially limits that major life activity. Now let's get to that second part. What is a major life activity, right? Major life activities are things like walking and seeing and hearing and speaking, but it's also things like concentrating and thinking and learning. And also, this is really key, it's also things like the operation of bodily functions, like your circulation system, your immune system, and individual organs. And if that sounds like, well, gosh, it sounds like everything is covered. Yes and no. The idea of having those major bodily functions included was to ensure folks with diabetes were covered. When somebody, an employee or a job applicant, asks for an accommodation, the ADA requires that employers provide a reasonable accommodation, right? Now, an employer doesn't have to provide an accommodation if doing so causes an undue hardship to the business. Now, undue hardship is kind of those terms that does not have a very concrete, hard definition. Why? Because it varies. It means the accommodation would be too difficult, it's too expensive, it changes the way the business operates, and it's based on the employer's size, their financial resources, the needs of the business. There are so many things to consider. So undue hardship is thought of pretty openly, but the idea is that the employer is going to have to say it is too difficult and too expensive. We can't do that. And let's be honest, it has to be too expensive and too difficult. An employer can't just basically say, nope, I don't want to do this because it's going to cost me some money. And the fact is, honestly, the vast majority of accommodations, like more than half of them, cost absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. It could be something like having a little bit of workplace flexibility, or someone with diabetes requiring a break at a certain time to check their blood sugar levels. The other percentage, the vast majority of them, cost less than $500. It's not very much. So in general, it is pretty hard to deny a reasonable accommodation. Now, there is one other caveat in there, is that if the employer finds a different accommodation that is just as effective, they can use that other accommodation. They don't have to pick the same one that the individual requested. Is it legal to ask someone about their disability based on their accommodation request? So I'm going to break this out into short things. So one, is it legal to ask someone about their disability? And I'm going to assume this is an employment context. Asking someone about their disability legally, no, you cannot. The job applicant, no, you cannot. However, the moment an accommodation request is made, that changes things. So when a person asks for the accommodation, the employer is entitled to know that an employee has a covered disability, right? This is especially true when the disability or the need for the accommodation is not known or obvious, right? The other thing is, the employer should be asking the employee to basically provide documentation from their physician that says, hey, this is the nature and the severity and the duration of the impairment, and these are the activities that limit the individual, and then basically substantiates why an accommodation is needed. Those 1, 2, and 3 are the information that are helpful to an employer, because it says what it is, it says how it impacts the activity, basically how it impacts their work. And 3 says, hey, this is why that specific accommodation is needed. Those 3 things are what an employer should ask, and that are the best way to address an accommodation, and they're the best way an employee should go for it too, because it makes it very clear what you're asking, what your limitation is, and why you need it, because it will allow you to do that thing. What if you believe you're being discriminated against because of your disability? What do you do? And that's always a tough place to be in. So I'm going to start with the assumption that this might be an employment scenario. If it is an employment scenario under Title I of the ADA, then that is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And basically they cover all workplace discrimination. And the best thing to do is they have an 800 number, and they actually have an email address where you can send in the information about the discrimination and about this discriminatory incident. When it comes to disability discrimination, when it relates to state or local governments or in places of public accommodation, so remember that's Title II and Title III, that's actually enforced by the Department of Justice. And you can actually reach out to their disability division directly, or for these, you can actually go to the courts, which is, as we know, is a very slow system. The other alternative is that the ADA is the federal law that covers disability discrimination. Many states also have their own disability discrimination laws. Sometimes it parallels the ADA, sometimes it's a little bit different, but oftentimes it may be a little bit faster to find relief in that arena. If you come across disability discrimination in a place of public accommodation, like a hotel or a shop or a restaurant, which would be under Title III of the ADA, or under Title II, which is under a program that's basically sponsored or funded by a state or local government, then that falls under the purview of the U.S. Department of Justice. And they actually receive a lot of complaints from people all over the U.S., enough so that they have their own ADA information line, which is 1-800-514-0301. They also have it available in TTY, which is 1-833-610-1264. And basically, even if you don't want to take formal action, that complaint gives them a chance to kind of look for trends and other broader problems and ways they might be able to address things more broadly.
Are there any resources that you would suggest for further information?
Sure. So for further information on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and specifically on accommodations and accommodations in the workplace, probably one of the best places is the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. And you can find that at askjan.org, askjan.org. It is actually a technical assistance center that's funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. And what they specifically do and what they are experts at is actually helping both individuals and employers look at what are all the accommodations in the universe that might be available and most useful to you. What can you provide as an employer? What are your options? As an employee, if you go, I have a disability, but I'm not sure what might help me get my job done, they have decades of experience and say, here are some options that are available to you. They are available online. They have they used to have a dial-in line, I believe they still do, and this can be done directly, or you can actually request assistance from them anonymously.